They say the eyes are the windows to the soul, but when I looked at her, the windows were wide open and there was nobody home. Most people blink when they're surprised, or when they laugh, or when they die. But she didn't blink when the car hit her. She didn't blink when she stood up and snapped her bones back into place. She just kept those dry, glassy eyes fixed on mine, waiting for me to blink first so she could move. The blink is the body's most frequent prayer. We are born with this rhythmic mercy, a microscopic curtain fall that happens 14,000 times a day. It is a reset button for the soul, a momentary darkness that allows the brain to stitch reality together into a seamless quilt. Without it, the world would be a relentless, burning assault of light and grit. We never appreciate the blink until we encounter the thing that has no use for it. The Rusty Spoon was the kind of diner that existed only to provide a stage for the lonely and the lost. It smelled of ancient grease, stale coffee, and the metallic tang of an impending storm. The neon sign outside, a jagged fork dripping red light, hummed with a low-frequency buzz that vibrated in my molars. I sat in the corner booth, my notebook open to a page of half-finished thoughts that felt as hollow as the room. I was looking for a story, but I would soon learn that stories have a way of hunting you back. Then the door opened. She didn't enter so much as she appeared within the frame. She wore a floral dress, the patterns of faded roses looking like bruised skin under the diner's flickering fluorescence. She moved with a strange, gliding economy. No wasted sway of the hips, no tilt of the head. She sat at the counter, her back to me, facing the long, grease-filmed mirror that ran the length of the wall. I watched her through the reflection. Most people, when they sit, adjust themselves. They check their phones, they smooth their hair, they blink against the harshness of the light. She did none of it. She sat with her hands folded on the formica, as still as a taxidermy project. Her eyes were fixed on the reflection of a salt shaker. And as the minutes began to stretch into the uncomfortable territory of the impossible, I realized the horror of her face. Her eyelids were wide, too wide. The white of her sclera was a brilliant, sickly ivory that seemed to glow. She didn't just look at the world, she bore witness to it with a terrifying, unceasing hunger. The storm outside broke, a crack of thunder shaking the sugar pourers on the tables. I winced, my eyes instinctively snapping shut for a fraction of a second in response to the noise. When I opened them, she was still there, exactly as she was, unmoving, unfazed, unblinking. Curiosity is a dangerous itch. In the dark corners of the world, it is often the first symptom of a terminal mistake. I pulled my watch from my pocket, a heavy, brass-cased thing that ticked with a mechanical heartbeat. I placed it on the table, the rhythmic snick, snick, snick of the gears suddenly sounding like a countdown. I began to time her. It started as a cynical game, the kind a bored writer plays to pass the time in a dying town. I expected the game to end in 30 seconds, perhaps a minute. But the second hand swept past 12, then 3, then 6. She remained a portrait of impossible stillness. Her posture was so rigid it felt skeletal, as if the floral fabric of her dress was draped over a frame of iron wire rather than flesh and blood. The fluorescent tubes overhead hummed a dissonant chord, flickering with a violent rhythmic strobe that made my own eyes throb. Every time the light dipped into darkness, I expected to see the flutter of her lids in the strobe, a secret movement hidden in the shadows. But every time the light snapped back, her eyes were there, glassy, wet, fixed. 5 minutes passed. My own eyes began to burn in sympathy. The air in the diner was dry, pumped through ancient vents that smelled of scorched dust. I felt the mounting pressure behind my lids, the frantic biological demand for moisture. I blinked. I blinked twice, thrice. rubbing my face to clear the phantom grit. When I looked back at the mirror, she hadn't moved a millimeter. She was staring at a pyramid of creamer cups, but she wasn't seeing them. Her gaze had a terrifying depth to it, as if she were looking through the counter, through the floor, and into the dark, churning tectonic plates of the earth itself. It was the look of something that had seen the beginning of time and was prepared to watch the end of it without turning away. At the 8-minute mark, a fly landed on the bridge of her nose. It was a fat, iridescent thing, buzzing with frantic energy. It crawled toward the inner corner of her left eye, the most sensitive territory of the human face. It walked across the wet, ivory surface of her sclera. She didn't flinch. She didn't twitch. The eye remained a stagnant pool of white and obsidian, indifferent to the creature crawling upon its surface. That was when the fascination curdled into a cold, oily dread. This wasn't a trance. It wasn't a medical condition. It was a defiance of nature. To not blink is to refuse the most basic rhythm of life. It is to be a predator that does not want to miss the exact moment its prey breathes its last. The clock ticked toward 10 minutes. The storm outside had grown into a howling banshee, the wind rattling the diner's door in its frame like a ghost begging for entry. I looked at her reflection one last time, my heart hammering against my ribs, and that was when I saw it. The reflection of her eyes in the mirror didn't match the angle of her head. While her face was pointed at the creamer cups, the pupils in the mirror had shifted. They were looking directly at me. The moment our eyes met in the grease-filmed reflection, the world outside decided to end. The scream of tires on wet asphalt was the first warning, a high-pitched metallic shriek that tore through the hum of the diner like a jagged blade through silk. It was a sound of absolute helplessness. The sound of a multi-ton beast of iron losing its grip on reality. I didn't have time to gasp. I didn't even have time to blink. The front of the rusty spoon didn't just break, it detonated. The plate glass window, which had stood as a thin barrier between us and the howling night, transformed into a million diamond-edged projectiles. A vintage Ford truck, its headlights extinguished and its grille twisted into a snarl of chrome, roared through the wall. The sound was a symphony of destruction. The counter, the very formica where she had sat with her hands folded, was obliterated. Stools were uprooted like weeds. The air was instantly replaced by a choking fog of pulverized plaster, atomized gasoline, and the sharp, cozy scent of coffee grounds mixed with the copper tang of blood. I was thrown backward, my chair flipping as I hit the floor. The world spun into a dizzying blur of shadows and sparks. My head struck something hard, a table leg or the floor, and for a heartbeat, the darkness was absolute. When the ringing in my ears faded to a dull roar, the diner was unrecognizable. The truck was buried halfway into the room, its engine hissing like a dying dragon, sending plumes of acrid white steam toward the ceiling. Rain began to pour through the gaping hole in the building, sizzling as it hit the hot manifold of the truck. I wiped a smear of blood from my brow, my breath coming in ragged, panicked stutters. I looked toward the wreckage, expecting to see a gruesome scene. I expected the driver to be screaming. I expected the woman in the floral dress to be gone, erased by the sheer physics of the impact. The driver was there, slumped over a deployed airbag that was slowly deflating with a rhythmic wheezing hiss. He was silent. He was still. But it was the woman who stopped the air in my lungs. She was pinned between the truck's fender and the remains of the counter. The impact should have severed her in two. A jagged shard of glass, nearly a foot long, was buried deep in her cheek, protruding from the other side like a grotesque piece of jewelry. Her left arm was crushed, the bone snapped and protruding through the floral fabric of her sleeve, white and jagged against the red roses. And yet, as the steam swirled around her and the rain lashed her face, she was looking at me. Her eyes were wide, clear, and perfectly dry. Amidst the smoke, the dust, and the raining debris, she didn't flinch. She didn't blink. The shard of glass in her face didn't cause her eyes to water. The agony of her shattered arm didn't cause her pupils to contract. She remained a fixed point in a crumbling universe. Even as the blood from her cheek began to drip onto her collar, her gaze held mine with the same static, predatory focus it had held in the mirror. She was a witness to her own destruction, and she found it entirely unworthy of an eyelid's flutter. Pain is a language. It is the body's way of screaming no. But as I watched her pinned against the hissing radiator of the Ford, I realized she was deaf to it. The driver of the truck made a sound then, a wet, rattling sigh, and his head lolled to the side, final and heavy. He was gone. The only life left in that wreckage, besides my own trembling frame, was the woman in the floral dress. I waited for the scream. I waited for her to go into shock, for her eyes to roll back, for the biological systems to fail and the mercy of unconsciousness to take her. Instead, I heard a sound that will haunt the quiet spaces of my mind until the day I join that driver in the dirt. It was a wet, sliding noise. She began to pull herself away from the truck. She didn't use her hands to brace herself. She simply leaned back, her body dragging against the jagged chrome of the fender. The shard of glass in her cheek scraped against the metal, a sound like a diamond cutting into a mirror. She stood. She didn't stumble. She didn't favor the leg that looked crushed beneath her dress. She stood with a terrifying, upright precision, her feet finding purchase on the slick, blood-stained linoleum, as if she were stepping onto a ballroom floor. Then came the repair. She reached up with her right hand and gripped her shattered left arm. Her eyes stayed locked on mine, unblinking, unyielding, wide as saucers. As she twisted the limb, I heard the bones snap back into place, a sound like a heavy oak branch breaking under the weight of ice. She didn't hiss through her teeth. She didn't catch her breath. She simply reset the bone as one might straighten a crooked picture frame. She reached for the glass in her face. Her fingers, long and pale, wrapped around the red-stained shard. With a slow, deliberate motion, she pulled it out. The skin didn't close, but it didn't seem to matter. She dropped the glass. It hit the floor with a musical clink that sounded louder than the storm outside. I tried to find my voice. I wanted to ask if she was okay, but the words died in my throat, choked by the realization that okay was a concept that did not apply to her. She was not a victim of the accident. She was a passenger through it. She looked down at her floral dress, now tattered and soaked in a mixture of oil and her own dark, sluggish blood. For the first time, her expression changed. It wasn't a smile, not quite. The corners of her mouth twitched upward, but the eyes stayed the same. Those wide, dry, unblinking eyes remained fixed on me, absorbing my fear, documenting my every shuddering breath. She took a step toward me. The floorboards groaned under her weight, but her movement was silent. She didn't look down at the debris. She didn't look at the dead man in the truck. She moved with the singular, terrifying intent of a compass needle swinging toward true north. And I was her north. The diner was no longer a building. It was a carcass, and we were the parasites crawling within its ribs. She took another step, then another. Each movement was punctuated by a sound that didn't belong in a human body. A series of deep, resonant thumps and cracks that echoed off the surviving walls. It was the sound of a structural frame being forced back into alignment. It was the sound of dry timber groaning under the weight of a coming winter. Snap, slide, thump. I scrambled backward, my hands searching blindly behind me for a weapon or an exit. My fingers closed around a heavy glass sugar pourer. It felt pathetic, a toy in the face of a mountain. Stay back, I croaked. The words felt thin, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. She didn't stop. She didn't even acknowledge the sound of my voice. The only thing that existed for her was the space between us, a space she was closing with a terrifying rhythmic deliberation. As she moved through the flickering light of the dying neon sign, I saw the true extent of the branches breaking inside her. With every stride, her knees made a popping sound that made my own joints ache. Her neck tilted at a sharp, unnatural angle, then straightened with a sound like a wet towel being wrung out. She was reconfiguring. Whatever intelligence sat behind those unblinking eyes was busy stitching the meat and bone back into a functional shape, and it didn't care how much noise the process made. The air around her seemed to grow cold, or perhaps it was just the shock finally setting in. I reached the back exit, a heavy steel door that led to the alleyway and the dumpster. I fumbled for the crash bar, my eyes never leaving hers. For a heartbeat, the flickering light overhead caught her eyes at just the right angle. They weren't just dry, they were dusty. A thin layer of the plaster dust from the ceiling had settled on her corneas, coating the ivory and obsidian in a dull gray film. She didn't blink to clear it. She didn't tear up to wash it away. She simply stared through the dirt, her vision unhampered by the debris that would have blinded a god. "What are you?" I whispered, my hand finally slamming against the door's release. The door swung open, and the freezing rain of the storm lashed against my back. The alleyway was a canyon of shadows, smelling of wet brick and rot. She stopped at the edge of the wreckage, where the light of the diner met the darkness of the night. She stood perfectly still, her floral dress fluttering in the wind, her shattered arm now hanging straight and true at her side. Then she did something that broke the last of my resolve. She leaned forward, her torso tilting nearly 45 degrees without her feet moving an inch. She sniffed the air, not a quick breath, but a long, slow draw of oxygen that whistled through the wound in her cheek. She wasn't tracking me by sight anymore. She was tasting the scent of my terror on the wind. I turned and ran. The rain was a cold, liquid needles against my skin, but it provided no sanctuary. I ran blindly through the labyrinth of the town's industrial district, my boots splashing through deep puddles that hid the uneven asphalt. Every few seconds I risked a glance over my shoulder, hoping to see the alleyway empty, hoping to see that the nightmare had remained pinned to the wreckage of the truck. But she was there. She wasn't running. That was the most agonizing part. She was walking with a steady, metronomic pace. Yet, no matter how fast I sprinted, the distance between us didn't seem to grow. She moved through the downpour like a ghost through a graveyard, untouched by the chaos of the elements. I rounded a corner into a street lined with boarded-up warehouses, the kind of place where the streetlights had long ago been pelted into darkness by stones. The only illumination came from the occasional rhythmic strobe of distant lightning. Flash. I saw her 50 yards back, standing in the middle of the road. Her head was tilted, tracking my heat, my sound, my essence. Darkness. I pushed my lungs until they burned like they were filled with lye. My heart was a panicked bird beating against the cage of my ribs. I ducked into the shadow of a loading dock, pressing my back against the cold, corrugated metal of a rolling door. I held my breath, clenching my jaw so hard I thought my teeth might shatter. I waited. The only sound was the rhythmic drum, drum, drum of the rain on the metal roof above me. Then I heard it. A soft, wet slap of bare feet on pavement. She had lost her shoes somewhere in the wreckage. The sound was intimate, visceral, the sound of skin meeting wet stone. It stopped directly in front of my hiding spot. I squeezed my eyes shut, a reflex of the weak, but I knew she wouldn't do the same. I could feel her gaze burning through the metal door, through the darkness, through my very eyelids. To her, the dark wasn't a shroud. It was just another layer of reality she refused to blink away. I realized then that she didn't just see the world, she held it. Every object her eyes touched was pinned by her attention like an insect to a board. And right now, I was the only specimen in her collection. I opened my eyes to the smallest crack. Through the gap between the loading dock and the door, I saw her. She was standing 5 feet away. She wasn't looking at the door. She was looking at the ground, at a single muddy footprint I had left behind. She didn't lean down. She didn't blink as the rain flooded into her wide-open eyes, washing away the plaster dust from the diner but leaving the stare unchanged. She simply watched the footprint as the rain slowly began to melt it away. She was waiting. She knew that my body was a machine of limits. I needed to breathe. I needed to sleep. I needed to blink. She needed none of it. She was the personification of the unobserved. She was the thing that happens when no one is watching, except she was always watching. The human mind is a treacherous thing. When it cannot find safety, it seeks the familiar. I made the mistake that every hunted animal makes. I headed for my burrow. I scrambled from the loading dock, my muscles screaming in protest. My car was 3 blocks away, a rusted sedan parked in the shadow of a condemned textile mill. I reached it, fumbling with my keys with hands so numb they felt like wooden blocks. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the lock, and for a heartbeat, I allowed myself the luxury of a sob. The engine groaned, hesitated, then turned over with a rough, uneven idle. I threw the car into gear and floored it. As I sped through the rain-slicked streets of the suburbs, I kept my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. The road behind me was a void of black asphalt and silver rain. No headlights, no silhouettes, nothing. I began to tell myself the lie, the beautiful, necessary lie, that I had lost her, that she was just a broken thing of meat and bone, and that even her impossible stare had a range. I reached my house, a modest colonial at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. The neighborhood was asleep. No lights in the windows, no movement on the lawns, just the rhythmic ticking of my car's cooling engine as I sat in the driveway, staring at my front door. I ran inside, locked the deadbolt, threw the chain, and leaned my forehead against the cool wood. I breathed in the scent of my own life, stale air, old books, the lingering ghost of morning toast. I was safe. Then I saw the car in the driveway through the sidelight window. I had left the headlights on, 2 cones of white light cut through the downpour, illuminating the edge of the woods that bordered my property. She was standing at the edge of the light. She hadn't followed me on foot. No human, no thing could have crossed those miles that quickly. Yet there she was, her floral dress plastered to her skin, her hair a matted veil around that unmoving face. She was standing exactly where the light ended and the darkness began. The distance between the diner and the alley had been yards. The distance between the alley and the warehouse had been blocks. Now the distance was only the length of my front lawn. The space was shrinking. It wasn't just physical distance. It was a conceptual closing of the gap. She was narrowing the world down until it consisted only of 2 points, her unblinking eyes and my flickering ones. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I turned off the porch light, plunging the entryway into shadow, thinking that if I couldn't see her, the connection would be severed. But I could still feel it. A physical sensation, like a needle pressing against the back of my skull. Even through the wood, even through the dark, the weight of her observation was absolute. She didn't need to see my face to watch me. She was watching the house. She was watching the air I breathed. She was watching the time I had left. There is a specific kind of terror that comes with the violation of a sanctuary. A home is not just 4 walls. It is a psychological boundary. It is the place where we believe the rules of the world can be kept at bay. But as I stood in the dark of my hallway, I realized that for the woman in the floral dress, walls were merely a change in scenery. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't want to be a silhouette against the window, a glowing target in a dark box. I crept into the kitchen, my bare feet sticking slightly to the linoleum, a sound that seemed deafening in the silence. I reached for a kitchen knife, a heavy chef's blade, but my hands were shaking so violently it rattled against the magnetic strip. I forced myself to look out the small, frosted window of the back door. The backyard was a graveyard of shadows. The swing set I'd never removed stood like a gallows in the rain, and there, standing precisely in the center of the lawn, was the woman. She was closer now, 20 feet. The rain lashed at her, but she didn't shiver. She didn't wipe the water from her eyes. She stood with her chin slightly tilted up, as if she were bathing in the storm. Then the sound started. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't a bang. It was a soft, rhythmic thump, thump, thump against the side of the house. It moved. It started at the back door and began to travel along the siding, passing the kitchen window, moving toward the living room. It was the sound of a blind person feeling their way, or a predator testing the perimeter for a weakness. I followed the sound from the inside, pressed against the wallpaper, my heart a frantic drum. The thumping stopped at the large picture window in the living room. I looked. I couldn't help it. She was standing on the other side of the glass. The frosted pane of the front door had been a blur, but here she was vivid. The light from a distant street lamp caught the moisture on her face. Her skin was a pale, translucent gray, and the wound in her cheek had begun to pucker, the edges white and bloodless. But it was the eyes. Through the glass, they looked larger, magnified by the droplets of rain. They were fixed on mine. There was no glass between our souls, only a thin sheet of silica that felt like it was melting under the heat of her stare. She raised her hand. Slowly, she pressed her palm against the glass. She didn't push. She didn't try to break it. She simply held it there, and then she leaned in until her forehead touched the window. She stared through the pane with such intensity that I felt a sharp, stabbing pain behind my own eyes. She was waiting for the glass to fail, not by force, but by the sheer weight of her presence. I realized then that she wasn't trying to get in. She was waiting for me to let her in. She was waiting for the moment my eyes would betray me, the moment I would blink and in that microsecond of darkness acknowledge that she was the only thing left in my world. The ceiling fan above me spun with a lazy, rhythmic click-clack, and every rotation felt like a hammer blow to my psyche. It had been hours, or perhaps it had been lifetimes. Time loses its grip when you are forced to maintain a continuous thread of consciousness. I sat on the floor of the living room, my back pressed against the cold plaster of the wall furthest from the window. I had propped a hand mirror on a coffee table in front of me, angled so I could see the reflection of the front door behind me. I was trapped in a geometric prison of observation. My eyes were no longer my own. They were twin spheres of agony. The air in the house was stagnant, filled with the dry electric scent of a running refrigerator and the salt of my own sweat. My corneas felt as though they had been rubbed with fine grit sandpaper. The capillaries had long ago surrendered, rupturing until the whites of my eyes were a solid, bruised crimson, a roadmap of a man who had forgotten how to sleep. Tears streamed down my face, but they weren't the tears of sorrow. They were the body's frantic, desperate attempt at irrigation. My eyelids were twitching, a violent subcutaneous mutiny. Every few seconds the muscles would jump, a frantic pleas for the curtain to fall just for a millisecond. I knew that millisecond was all she needed. I looked into the hand mirror. Through the side light of the door, I could see her silhouette. She hadn't moved. She had become a part of the architecture of my house, a new pillar on the porch. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating fog that clung to the windows like a shroud. "Please," I whispered, but my tongue was a dry piece of leather in a desert. I thought of Poe's telltale heart, of the vulture eye that drove a man to madness. But this was worse. The vulture was outside, and it wasn't waiting for me to die. It was waiting for me to flinch. To blink is to admit a lapse in the world. It is a confession that we cannot bear the weight of the now. My vision began to fail. Dark spots danced at the periphery of my sight, phantom shapes that mimicked her floral dress. The static predator was winning. My brain, starved of the momentary darkness it needed to process reality, was beginning to hallucinate. The walls seemed to breathe. The shadows in the corner of the room began to lengthen, stretching like dark fingers toward my feet. I reached for a bottle of saline solution I had grabbed from the bathroom, squeezing the cold plastic until a stream of liquid hit my open eye. It stung like acid. I choked back a scream, my hands clawing at the carpet. In the mirror, I saw her head tilt. She heard the liquid hit the floor. She heard the hitch in my breath. She knew the salt was winning. She knew the strain was tearing me apart from the inside out. I was a clock with a broken spring, ticking faster and faster toward a silent halt. The end did not come with a scream. It came with a sigh of the flesh. I sat in the center of my living room, a broken compass in a house that no longer felt like home. My vision had narrowed to a pinhole of grainy gray. The edges of the world were fraying, dissolving into the static of a dead television channel. My eyes were no longer windows. They were open wounds. I looked at the mirror one last time. She was no longer on the porch. The side light of the door was empty, just a vertical bar of moonlight and fog. My heart leapt with a sickening hope. Had she gone? Had the dawn, pale and weak, frightened her back into the shadows of the diner? Then I heard it. A soft, dry slide from the kitchen. She hadn't broken the door. She hadn't forced the lock. She had simply waited for the house itself to give in, for a window to settle, or a latch to slip under the weight of her stare. She was inside. I tried to stand, but my legs were water. I collapsed back against the wall, my head hitting the plaster with a dull thud. My eyelids were vibrating now, a frantic, visible pulse that I could feel in my very brain. The urge to blink had transcended physical discomfort. It had become an existential scream. Just once, my brain pleaded. Just a flick of the wrist, a moment of peace, a second of dark. I saw her floral dress at the edge of the hallway. She moved without a sound, a blur of faded roses and pale skin. She didn't rush, she didn't growl. She simply glided into the room, her eyes, those wide, dusty obsidian spheres, locking onto mine from across the carpet. The distance was gone. She stood over me, her shadow falling across my face like a heavy wool blanket. Up close, she smelled of ozone and wet earth and something ancient, something that had never known the warmth of a breath. Her eyes were so close I could see my own reflection in them, a red-eyed, haggard ghost of a man. I saw the moisture on her eyes finally beginning to dry, the surface turning dull like slate, and yet she did not flinch. "Why?" I whispered. She didn't answer. She didn't have a voice because she didn't have a breath to carry it. She just leaned down, her face inches from mine, her parched corneas almost touching my own. The weight of the world became too much. The salt, the grit, the light, the terror, it all coalesced into a single inevitable demand. My nervous system snapped. The curtain fell. My eyelids slammed shut. It was the most beautiful sensation I have ever known. For 1/10 of a second, the world was dark. The pain vanished. The burning stopped. I felt the cool, wet relief of my own tears washing over my pupils. I felt the reset. I felt the mercy. And in that microsecond of darkness, I felt her cold, dry fingers wrap around my throat. When I opened my eyes, the room was empty. The morning sun was bleeding through the windows, casting long, cheerful bars of gold across the carpet. The front door was locked. The house was silent, but I don't go near the tree line anymore. I don't look in mirrors, and I never, ever sit with my back to an open room, because even now, as the sun shines, I can still feel it. A physical pressure against the back of my neck, a weight that never leaves. She didn't kill me. She did something much worse. She moved into the parts of my sight I can't see. She is in the corner of my eye, in the shadow behind my head, in the darkness that comes every time I blink. And the worst part? My eyes are starting to feel dry. I haven't felt the need to blink in 3 hours. I think I'm starting to learn. If you like this video, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, because it really helps out the channel. We have new stories releasing Monday through Friday. So until then, haunt